It all started with a letter taped to my front gate. Nothing official, just a piece of printer paper with a badly formatted logo at the top and a tone that immediately made me raise an eyebrow. It said my property, my ranch, was in violation of neighborhood standards and demanded that I immediately comply with HOA landscaping rules. Now, the funny thing is I don't belong to any HOA. My ranch sits on land that's been in my family for generations. We're on the edge of town, with fences stretching wide across the hills and livestock grazing peacefully under the open sky. I have no neighbors within shouting distance, and certainly no one who has any authority to tell me how to mow my fields or where to park my truck. So, at first, I laughed it off. I figured it was a mistake. But a few days later, I got another letter. This one was a bit more aggressive, printed on actual letterhead, and filled with citations for things like unsightly fencing, non-compliant vehicle storage, and livestock noise violations. Still, I ignored it. My land isn't zoned under the HOA's coverage area. They had no power over me. That's when the visits started. One morning, I spotted a white SUV creeping along the gravel road outside my property. It parked just past the gate, and a woman in a power suit stepped out with a clipboard. She took photos of my barn, my gate, even my horses. I walked down to the fence and asked what she was doing. She introduced herself as chairwoman of the HOA Compliance Committee and started rattling off her concerns like she was giving a courtroom speech. I told her plainly, this land is privately owned and not part of her HOA. She didn't flinch. She told me I'd eventually fall in line like everyone else. The audacity was almost impressive. A few days later, another letter came, this time warning me of fines if I didn't remove the unauthorized structures from my land. That included my barn. I called the county to make sure I wasn't missing something. They confirmed my property is entirely independent and not governed by any HOA. I was free to live as I pleased. But the HOA didn't seem to care about that little detail. Over the next week, I got 3 noise complaints filed with the sheriff's department. Each one claiming my animals were disturbing the peace. I had a livestock permit. The deputy who showed up was polite, but clearly annoyed that his time was being wasted. I showed him my paperwork. He left, shaking his head. Then someone reported me for running a commercial business without a permit. That came with an unannounced inspection from a city official. I showed him around. No business here, just a working ranch. He left apologizing, clearly aware he'd been sent on a wild goose chase. It became obvious the HOA had declared war. I installed a few trail cams near the front of my property, just in case. I caught images of people walking right up to my gate at night, sticking flyers and envelopes onto it. One of them even left a typed-out eviction warning in a plastic sleeve. The nerve. But I stayed calm. They wanted a reaction. What they got was silence. But behind that silence, I started doing my homework. I dug into public records. Looked up their bylaws. Looked up their debts. Turns out their HOA was barely hanging on. Poor financial management, lawsuits from residents, and deferred maintenance costs piling up. The land they used for their clubhouse and trails? Still technically owned by a holding company that hadn't been paid in years. Now that was interesting. I met with a local attorney, then a land consultant, then a banker. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not yet. But I was taking notes. Tracking patterns. Quietly buying parcels of land where I could. Slowly acquiring leverage, while the HOA kept wasting their time trying to force me out of my own ranch. They didn't know they were poking a bear who wasn't just prepared to defend his home, but might just end up owning theirs. About a week after I secured the last piece of land, something unusual happened. The HOA board scheduled a mandatory emergency meeting and started putting up flyers all over the neighborhood. They didn't know I had already bought a few of the rental homes, so naturally, I sent a proxy to attend that meeting, one of the tenants I'd quietly placed there after buying the property. I told him to sit in the back, keep quiet, and take notes. What came out of that meeting was even more outrageous than I expected. Turns out, the board had just found out they'd lost control of the shared-use property, the trails, the small park, the clubhouse, the entry signage, even part of their private road maintenance budget. They were panicking. They didn't know who had bought the land, just that their access was no longer guaranteed. And because they had written those amenities into their community bylaws and home valuations, losing them wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. It meant property values could tank. So what did they decide to do? Instead of investigating further or asking the county for help, they doubled down. I got another notice in the mail. This one was laughably dramatic. Final warning: remove your fencing and vacate your illegally annexed property within 10 days to avoid legal escalation. The best part? It came with a bill for $18,473 in code violations. They were still acting like they had any power over me. It was almost cute. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and told him to send a formal notice of ownership change. This one wasn't just a cease and desist, it was a notice of operational transfer. The HOA was now using land I owned, and they had no legal rights to do so without a lease or permission. My lawyer gave them 15 days to respond before filing an injunction. That's when things got weird. One evening, I came back from riding the property line and saw a group of people parked just outside my gate. They weren't neighbors. They looked like they were from the board, clipboards, business casual clothes, standing in a little huddle like they were planning something. I didn't approach. I just watched from a distance. Then, a few hours later, I saw what they had done. They tried to move my fence. Yep. In the dark. They pulled out a section of it, probably to make it look like my boundaries were illegitimate. Maybe to claim I was encroaching. I don't know what they were thinking, but I had cameras rolling the whole time. And since I'd already filed ownership paperwork with the county, I forwarded the footage directly to the sheriff's office. Trespassing, vandalism, and attempted property damage. A deputy showed up the next morning. Not just to take a report, he came with printed copies of the footage, clearly already briefed. He was polite but firm. I asked him what the HOA's plan was now that they were cornered. He smiled and said, "Looks like they didn't expect someone to know the law better than they do." Meanwhile, inside the HOA board, rumors were spreading. Residents were starting to ask questions. Why are our trails suddenly blocked off? Why did our landscaper stop coming? Why did our trash pickup change? See, once I acquired those service contracts, I had options. I didn't cancel anything, I just adjusted them. Slowly. Carefully. Not out of spite, but to make sure they knew something had shifted. I even set up a small sign at the trail entrance, * private property. Entry by permit only. * that stirred the pot. It wasn't long before my phone rang. This time, it was a board member. She was frantic, asking if I'd bought the land and if we could maybe come to an understanding. I told her I'd be happy to talk once the board admitted they had no authority over my ranch, stopped sending fake citations, and dropped all complaints with the county. Her tone changed immediately. She got defensive, said that wouldn't be possible, that they had rules to uphold. I simply told her to expect a lease agreement, or a lock on their clubhouse. They wanted a war over property lines. But this was never about fences. It was about power, control, and entitlement. And now they were learning that sometimes, the land bites back. It wasn't long before the harassment became routine. Every few days, like clockwork, I'd find some new threat stuck to my front gate or slipped into my mailbox. Most of the time, it was the same recycled nonsense. Citations for unauthorized livestock, warnings about non-compliant architecture, and even a strange one about unpermitted wind noises. I'm not kidding, they tried to fine me for the wind. That's how far they were reaching. I stopped opening the letters after a while. Just threw them in a folder marked "For Court," in case this ever escalated beyond paper threats. But they weren't stopping there. I started noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the entrance to my property. Same SUV. Same woman. Same clipboard. She'd stand by the road, making notes, snapping photos, sometimes talking into her phone and pointing toward my house like I was some kind of criminal enterprise. One afternoon, I saw her talking to one of my ranch hands who was fixing a fence. She must have thought he was just some worker she could intimidate, but he politely told her she had no business on the property and asked her to leave. She didn't. She stood there arguing until I showed up. When I did, she waved her clipboard like a badge and claimed I was in contempt of community code. That's when I told her, very clearly, to back off. This wasn't their neighborhood. This was private land, and they had no claim on it. Her reply? Not for long. That's when I knew. They were planning something bigger. See, while I'd been calm on the surface, underneath I'd been documenting everything. I had photos, timestamps, even video from the trail cams showing them trespassing. But more importantly, I'd been watching the land records. And that's when I struck gold. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were over-leveraged. Their funds were drying up. Turns out, they had borrowed money from a development trust years ago to upgrade their landscaping, walking trails, and clubhouse. But the payments weren't keeping up. And that trust? It was looking to offload some properties. It only took a couple of meetings. A few quiet transactions. I wasn't interested in the homes, just the land. The trails, the easements, the parking lots. All still owned by that trust. With the right lawyer and a little money, I bought it all. And I didn't stop there. I kept digging and found out several rental homes in the neighborhood were in foreclosure. A handful of absentee owners were behind on HOA dues and taxes. I made offers. Bought them cheap. Then I bought the rights to the landscaping company the HOA had been using for maintenance. The same one they hadn't paid in 3 months. And the best part? The management company they had contracted to enforce rules and handle their paperwork. Also owned by a holding group that was barely hanging on. I made them an offer too. It was quiet. Quiet enough that the HOA board didn't see it coming. They still thought I was just some stubborn rancher refusing to move my barn. Meanwhile, I was slowly turning the tables. I sent a cease and desist letter through my lawyer, officially informing the HOA they were trespassing, harassing, and operating outside of their jurisdiction. They ignored it. Then they sent someone to inspect my property again. That person? Detained by the sheriff for ignoring posted warnings. It was becoming clear to me they believed they were invincible. That their little community rules outweighed private property rights. But what they didn't know was how deep I'd already embedded myself into their system. How the very roots of their neighborhood were now tangled up in deals they couldn't see, with contracts they'd never read. I wasn't angry anymore. I was strategic. Focused. The more they pressed, the deeper they dug their own hole. And while they were busy scribbling fake fines and measuring my fence with tape measures, I was already working with county officials to start redrawing the lines. Lines that would soon show something they never imagined, my ranch, right in the center of their precious HOA map. Not as an outsider, but as the new owner of the very land their rules were printed on. They tried to keep face. For a couple more days, the HOA went quiet. No new threats. No new fake fines. But I knew that was just the calm before their next move. And sure enough, it came this time in the form of an official-looking document taped to my gate. Cease and desist construction, unapproved structure expansion. I laughed out loud reading it. There was no construction. No expansion. The only thing I'd done recently was fix the same gate they kept trying to damage, and paint my barn side wall after it got scratched up by a delivery truck. But they were clearly desperate to regain control of anything. So they did what HOA boards do best, make up rules and act like they're law. This time, though, I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't even respond. I let them stew in silence. And while they kept circling like vultures, I went ahead with the plan that had been sitting in my back pocket for weeks. I had bought a small, empty parcel that backed directly up to the neighborhood's green belt. It was technically outside the HOA's control according to their own charter, but it connected to their walking trails, and residents treated it like it was part of their park. The HOA never maintained it. Never cleaned it. But now, it was mine. So, I fenced it off. Not a tall fence, just enough to let everyone know something had changed. I posted signs too, *private agricultural land, no public access. Within 24 hours, my phone started ringing again. This time, not the board, but angry neighbors. A woman claiming she walked her dog there every morning, telling me I had no right. Another guy yelling that his kids played ball there and I was ruining the neighborhood spirit. I calmly told each of them the same thing: the HOA doesn't own that land. I do. And if they had a problem with it, they could take it up with their board. The beauty of it was that it forced the residents to turn on the HOA. Complaints started rolling in during the next board meeting. People were furious that their dues had gone up, their trash service was erratic, and now their favorite shortcut to the trails was blocked. But the board couldn't say anything. They didn't even know I had bought the land until I made it obvious. While they scrambled to find answers, I kept applying pressure. I had the landscaping service reprice their contracts. Since I owned the company now, I bumped the rates up just enough to make it sting unless they wanted to renegotiate through me personally. Trash collection. I paused their pickups for 3 days, citing a contract audit. It was legal. It was controlled. And it was just enough to make the residents start questioning who really had authority in their own neighborhood. Then, just to twist the knife a little deeper, I sent a notice to the HOA informing them that I was preparing a development proposal for a utility barn near their clubhouse. Nothing massive. Just a basic structure for agricultural equipment storage. Completely legal, within my rights, and technically within their map's boundary lines now since I owned half the shared land around it. You should have seen the response. Panic letters. Desperate calls. One board member even tried to offer me a mutual cooperation agreement if I would just leave the property alone. That was my moment. I told them I'd consider backing off if they formally recognized that my ranch was not under their jurisdiction, erased all past citations, and published a statement to the neighborhood clearing my name. They stalled. Tried to play tough. Even hinted they'd seek legal help. But they didn't know that I'd already hired the county's top zoning attorney, who had been waiting for them to challenge me. And while they were drafting hollow threats, my lawyer was finalizing a proposal to formally redraw the zoning lines, one that would officially absorb their walking trails, parking zones, and entry signage into my ranch's private domain. All backed by the new land purchases and contracts they had never bothered to track. They thought they could run me out with fines, threats, and intimidation. But instead, they were watching their power slip through their fingers, one quiet deal at a time. They thought silence would make me back off. The HOA stopped sending letters, stopped making calls, and even the security patrols vanished. To most folks, it looked like peace had returned. But I knew better. When you've dealt with HOA boards long enough, you learn that silence usually means they're plotting something bigger behind closed doors. And I was right. It started with a surprise inspection. Not from the HOA, but from the county. A clipboard-wielding official showed up at my ranch gate, claiming he had received an anonymous tip about unlicensed commercial activity on the premises. He wanted to check permits, inspect buildings, and walk the entire property. When I asked what kind of activity he meant, he just said possible livestock breeding and mechanical work, which was laughable. That's exactly what a ranch does. But the weird part? He brought a deputy along, just in case. That's when it clicked. The HOA had tried to bypass me by involving the county, probably hoping they'd find anything, to shut me down or fine me. Unfortunately for them, I had nothing to hide. Every structure had been signed off, every animal registered, every piece of equipment properly logged. I even had digital files ready to send right from my phone. The inspector left empty-handed. And annoyed. Still, it confirmed what I already suspected: the HOA wasn't finished. They were just changing tactics. A week later, a petition started circulating in the neighborhood, a real one, with physical signatures. It claimed my presence was disruptive to the community and that the residents would feel safer if I no longer had property rights within the shared boundary. Their goal? To get enough signatures to pressure the township to revoke or rezone my land status. At this point, I wasn't even mad. I was impressed. They had gone from phony fines to weaponizing bureaucracy to now trying to erase my property through public opinion. But what they didn't realize was just how many people in that neighborhood quietly supported me. The moment I heard about the petition, I called a few friends who lived on the block, older folks, some with land backgrounds, others just fed up with the HOA themselves. We organized a barbecue. Not on their turf. On mine. And we made it open invite. Word spread fast. A Saturday cookout, free food, live music, all hosted by the guy the HOA hated. I expected maybe a dozen folks. Over 50 showed up. Even some of the board members' spouses came, quietly, of course. People were laughing, eating, sharing stories. And every single one of them told me the same thing: we're tired of the board. You're not the problem here. Turns out, the HOA had built more enemies than just me. A young couple had been fined for their dogs barking, even though it turned out to be another neighbor's pet. One man said they painted his curb yellow to fake a fire lane just to keep him from parking in front of his house. These weren't small mistakes, they were patterns. So I took notes. I asked questions. And I built something better than a defense. I built a case. I already had the zoning attorney on standby. Now, I brought in a private investigator. Just to check into a few things. Like who really approved that HOA president's remodeling project that broke 3 noise ordinances. Or how that community beautification fund kept going over budget, with no receipts filed. While I waited for results, I started speaking up in their own meetings. That's right, I showed up. Technically, they couldn't ban me from attending since part of my land now included shared access zones. So I walked right in, sat at the back, and took notes. You'd be surprised how nervous people get when the guy they've been slandering shows up with a notepad and a calm smile. The HOA president's voice shook every time she read through new motions. They knew I was building something. They just didn't know what yet. And all the while, the town council started getting letters from both sides. The board pushing their petition. My allies pushing back. What the board didn't realize was, while they were writing complaints, I was buying another parcel. One that touched their community pool. They had no idea what I was really building until it was too late. While they obsessed over petitions and tried to squeeze the township into siding with them, I stayed focused on the land. Quietly. Strategically. I knew that one more purchase would seal everything together, and I found it. A narrow stretch of land between the HOA's pool area and their so-called community recreation zone. Barely an acre, long forgotten, owned by an out-of-town investor who only ever used it for tax write-offs. I made a cash offer. Fast, clean, no negotiation. Within days, the deed was in my name. Which meant that now, the only access to the HOA's beloved pool and clubhouse had to go through my property. Not a shared easement. Not a public path. My land. That's when the fireworks started. They didn't come knocking. They came yelling. 2 board members and one of their legal advisors showed up at my gate, trying to intimidate me with paperwork and community codes. I didn't even let them past the first post. I had cameras on every corner, and I knew the law better than they thought I did. I told them, politely, that trespassing signs weren't decorations. They left frustrated, but I knew the next move would be nastier. Sure enough, 2 days later, the HOA sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming I was restricting community access and threatening the well-being of residents. They accused me of holding shared property hostage, and even claimed I was interfering with local kids' ability to use the community pool. What they didn't include in the email? That the HOA itself never filed the easement for that access path. They'd built the clubhouse on shaky paperwork, assuming they could fix it later, and never did. Now, that hole in their foundation was mine to own. Literally. So, I posted a formal notice at the pool gate: private property access, permission required. I didn't lock it. I didn't block it. I just made it clear that without a formal agreement, every step onto that path was a legal risk. And suddenly, the residents started asking questions. Why hadn't the board done the paperwork? Why didn't they secure the rights years ago? Why did this guy, the one they were told to hate, have more legal ground than the people supposedly protecting the neighborhood? Parents were furious. Not at me. At the HOA. But the final straw came the following week, when a city inspector, not the county this time, arrived at the clubhouse. Clipboard in hand. He asked to see permits for the clubhouse structure and access trails. He asked to verify ADA compliance, safety protocols, and occupancy limits. The board was caught flat-footed. One of them tried to bluff, saying it was all grandfathered in. But the inspector shook his head. Someone had filed a formal complaint about improper zoning, and now the whole thing was under review. You want to guess who filed the complaint? That's right. My attorney had found enough inconsistencies in their original zoning paperwork to raise red flags. And when it was all submitted, politely, properly, and legally, the city had no choice but to inspect. And the residents? They were watching all of it unfold. Suddenly, the HOA meetings were packed. For the first time, regular homeowners were showing up, demanding answers. Why had dues gone up? Why were legal threats being made instead of deals? Why hadn't the board just worked something out with the ranch owner? The board president tried to calm things down. She claimed I was unreasonable, that I was the one escalating things. But one of the parents stood up and asked something that stopped the whole room cold. If he's so unreasonable, why do all the legal papers say he's right? Dead silence. I didn't even have to say a word. My case was speaking for itself. The fences, the signs, the land records, the contracts all lined up, all above board. And now, even the city was getting involved. They couldn't reverse any of it, because I hadn't broken a single law. I had just used the HOA's own laziness and arrogance against them. Every day that passed, their grip got weaker. And my ranch? It wasn't going anywhere. But their power? It was vanishing by the minute. The strangest part was how quiet everything became. No more emails. No more HOA board members knocking. The meetings stopped being announced. The newsletters dried up. You could almost feel the silence hanging in the air like fog after a storm. It was as if the entire neighborhood was waiting for something, but they didn't know what. Meanwhile, I just kept going. I had one more card to play. You see, while they were trying to force me off my ranch, accusing me of lowering property values and violating some nonsense landscaping rules, I was quietly making calls to developers. Not big corporations. Independent local builders who were tired of dealing with restrictive HOAs. I told them about my land. I told them about the location. And I told them one critical fact: now that I owned the land their neighborhood was built on, I could legally propose a new residential extension right on their backyards. A small cul-de-sac. Maybe 8 or 9 homes. High quality, but without HOA oversight. That was the key. No mandatory dues. No board. No overreach. Just freedom. One of the developers jumped at the chance. We signed a preliminary agreement. And just like that, I submitted a zoning application to the city. The plans showed my property connecting to the HOA's roads. Legally, they had to allow it. They didn't own the roads, the county did. That's what happens when a neighborhood forgets to read the fine print in its own bylaws. When the application went public, the neighborhood lost it. Suddenly, people who had never even looked in my direction were ringing my gate bell. They wanted to know what was happening. They were panicked. Would this mean more traffic? Would new homes ruin their aesthetic? Would the new owners have access to their pool, their walking trails, their exclusive events? And every time they asked, I just smiled and said, I'm simply using my property as I'm allowed to. Because that's what this was about from the beginning. They thought they could push me out with rules, fines, intimidation, and pressure. But they never considered what would happen if someone pushed back with patience and the law on their side. Then, almost like a final gasp, the HOA tried to hold a private emergency meeting. Not open to the public. No notice to homeowners. Just board members, scrambling to figure out how to stop the development. But one of their own board members, someone who had been quietly growing more uncomfortable with the direction things were headed, forwarded me the meeting notes. They were panicking. They didn't know how to reverse the damage. Some even suggested dissolving the HOA entirely, as if that would undo the ownership changes or the development plans. It was pure chaos behind closed doors, and no one outside their little circle had any trust left in them. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw it in their faces. I just kept moving. Contractors started showing up. Surveyors walked the new lines. Gravel trucks came in. And the residents. They stood on their porches and watched it happen. Helpless. Confused. Some of them whispered about moving. Others started looking for loopholes in their contracts to get out of paying dues to a board that no longer had real control over anything. Meanwhile, I walked my property like I always had. Quietly. With pride. I wasn't just a rancher anymore, I was the man who turned the entire HOA on its head without firing a single shot. Just land, law, and long-term thinking. The new homes. They weren't even finished yet, but they already had buyers lined up. Folks who didn't want rules about what color they could paint their door. Families who wanted land, freedom, and peace. People who were tired of being told what to do by neighbors with clipboards and too much free time. And as for the old board, well, they still tried to act important, for a little while. But it was like watching a dog bark behind a glass window, loud, dramatic, but totally powerless. They had their chance to work with me. Instead, they tried to bury me. And now, they had to live in a world where I wrote the rules.